On October 23, 2025, June Lockhart, the last surviving adult star of Lost in Space, passed away peacefully at the age of 100. Before her death, however, she had become increasingly open about the experiences and stories that had remained private for decades. Now, we can look back inside the Jupiter 2 and uncover the remarkable secrets that stayed hidden for nearly 60 years. The cast carried these memories throughout their lives, and with so many of them now gone, the stories they once kept quiet can finally be told. There is something deeply revealing about being one of the last people alive who remembers an entire era. After spending decades watching friends, co-stars, and colleagues disappear, there comes a point when protecting old secrets no longer feels necessary. During the final years of the Lost in Space cast, that is exactly what seemed to happen. The surviving members began speaking more openly about what life on the show had really been like. By 2025, only 3 members of the original Robinson children were still alive. Bill Mumy, who played Will Robinson from the age of 10 through 14, had turned 72. Angela Cartwright, who portrayed Penny Robinson, was 73, while Marta Kristen, who played Judy Robinson, had reached 81. June Lockhart, who portrayed their mother, had continued giving interviews and sharing memories right up until her death in Santa Monica on October 23, 2025. One of the most painful memories Lockhart discussed was how she discovered that Lost in Space had been canceled. There was no personal phone call from the network, no meeting with a producer, and no formal goodbye after 3 seasons of work. Instead, she discovered the news by reading a small announcement in the entertainment section of her morning newspaper. That was apparently the only farewell CBS gave the cast of a series that had become one of the most recognizable science fiction programs in American television history. Bill Mumy experienced the cancellation just as painfully. He was only 14 when the series ended, and decades later he recalled breaking down after his agent called with the news. He had finished the final season believing that another season was already being planned. Then the renewal list arrived, and Lost in Space was missing. For a 14-year-old who had spent nearly his entire childhood working on the series, learning that it was suddenly over was devastating. By the time these stories were being remembered, many of the show's most important figures were already gone. Mark Goddard, who played Don West, died in October 2023 at 87. Jonathan Harris, the unforgettable Dr. Smith, died in 2002. Bob May, the performer who spent 3 years inside the robot costume, died in 2009. Dick Tufeld, the voice of the robot, passed away in 2012. Yet the 3 surviving Robinson children continued to maintain their connection. In March 2026, Bill Mumy shared a photograph of himself with Angela Cartwright and Marta Kristen, describing them as Judy, Penny, and Will Robinson together again on Earth. More than 6 decades after the show premiered, they were still making time for one another. Their continued friendship reveals something that the original series never fully showed. Beneath the futuristic sets, strange creatures, and exaggerated adventures was a group of people who formed relationships that lasted for most of their lives. One of the most fascinating stories involves Jonathan Harris and the transformation of Dr. Smith. Before becoming the character audiences knew, Harris had grown up as the son of Russian immigrants in the Bronx. His father worked in Manhattan's garment district, and Harris later recalled growing up speaking with a strong Bronx accent. Determined to reinvent himself, he changed his surname from Karasukin to Harris when he was 17, despite his father's objections. He earned a pharmacy degree but never pursued the profession. Instead, he created an acting resume and worked his way into show business. Eventually, his career included Broadway, The Twilight Zone, and more than 100 stage productions. When Harris was offered the role of Dr. Smith, he immediately saw a problem. The character had originally been written as a dangerous villain who killed a guard during the pilot and attempted to use the robot against the Robinson family. He was expected to disappear after only a handful of episodes. Harris understood that a character written to die so quickly offered little long-term value to his career. So he began changing the character himself. Harris would arrive on set with rewritten dialogue and new pages that he had prepared overnight. He would tell the other performers that he had changed the dialogue and wanted to go over the scenes again. Bill Mumy, who was still a child, watched Harris reshape the character and later remembered being impressed by how deliberately he did it. Slowly, Dr. Smith became the center of the series. His exaggerated fear, dramatic complaints, insults toward the robot, and comic behavior were not simply the product of the original scripts. Harris helped create much of that personality himself. He invented insults such as bubble-headed booby, nickel-plated nincompoop, and bellicose bumpkin. His explanation was surprisingly logical. The robot constantly recognized Smith's schemes, so Smith needed to attack and insult it to prevent the robot from exposing him. The comedy, therefore, became part of Smith's survival strategy. The transformation worked. Fan mail began arriving in enormous numbers, with hundreds of letters every month asking about Dr. Smith. Irwin Allen eventually realized that the character had become too popular to remove. Harris later received a special guest star credit across all 83 episodes, an unusual billing arrangement at the time. But Dr. Smith's success came at a cost to another member of the cast. Guy Williams had originally entered Lost in Space as its leading man. He was already famous for playing Zorro for Disney and had become a recognizable television star. Tall, athletic, and trained in fencing from childhood, Williams seemed perfectly suited to play John Robinson, the intelligent commander who was supposed to lead his family through space. But his importance gradually diminished. During the first season, Williams's screen time began to shrink as Dr. Smith's stories became more prominent. By the second season, the pattern was obvious, and by the third, it had become the normal structure of the show. Williams would arrive, deliver a few lines, and then watch as Jonathan Harris, Bill Mumy, and the robot carried much of the episode. Mark Goddard later acknowledged that the show increasingly revolved around Smith and the robot, and that Williams was particularly unhappy about it. Even Jonathan Harris admitted that Williams had originally been hired as the star, but eventually found himself receiving only occasional lines. Harris understood how difficult that must have been for another actor, even though he had played a major role in the change. Williams found ways to occupy his time between scenes. He listened to classical music, studied astronomy, played chess, and followed the stock market. Bill Mumy even nicknamed him the Comb, because Williams was constantly grooming himself between takes. There was reportedly an especially tense confrontation between Williams and Harris in which Williams angrily threatened to kill Harris before quickly clarifying that he meant the fictional Dr. Smith. Whether the remark was completely serious or made in frustration, it reflected the tension surrounding Williams's declining role. After Lost in Space ended, Williams discovered that his Hollywood career had suffered. But thousands of miles away, his reputation was very different. In Argentina, his portrayal of Zorro had become enormously popular. He was treated almost like royalty, receiving a luxury apartment and invitations to important events. Williams eventually spent more than 2 decades living in Argentina. In May 1989, police entered his Buenos Aires apartment after friends became concerned about his disappearance. They found that he had died from a ruptured brain aneurysm approximately a week earlier. He was 65 years old. His death was especially tragic because he had been living alone, meaning nobody realized he was gone for days. Bill Mumy later recalled that after Lost in Space ended, he never saw Williams again. While Williams's story ended far from Hollywood, another member of the cast had endured a completely different kind of hardship on the same set. Bob May was the man inside the robot costume. To millions of viewers, the robot was one of the most lovable characters on the show. But behind those moving arms and metallic exterior was a performer dealing with extreme physical conditions. May had originally been at 20th Century Fox for another job when he was unexpectedly asked to try on the robot suit. The test was simple: if he fit inside the costume, he would get the job. After his first experience inside it, he emerged with cuts and bleeding caused by the metal edges. Despite that, he accepted the role. The robot costume weighed around 200 pounds. Under the intense studio lighting, the temperature inside could become unbearable. May later compared the experience to being trapped inside a combination of a sauna and jacuzzi. The costume also offered very little airflow. On at least 2 occasions, May reportedly lost consciousness inside the suit because of oxygen deprivation. His eyes rolled back and his body became limp before crew members realized what was happening. According to the story, production continued because there was supposedly no time to stop filming. May was also a heavy smoker and sometimes smoked cigarettes inside the costume during breaks. June Lockhart remembered seeing smoke coming through the robot's seams. On one occasion, Irwin Allen reportedly saw smoke rising from the costume and initially believed the robot was on fire. When he discovered that May was simply smoking, the incident became another strange part of the show's history. Despite physically performing the movements that made the robot famous, May did not receive on-screen credit during the original series. His lack of credit affected his compensation and residuals. Even as Lost in Space became an international phenomenon and generated licensing revenue for decades, May and his wife Judith lived in a mobile home park in California. In November 2008, their home was destroyed by the Sayre fire. Only 2 months later, Bob May died from congestive heart failure at the age of 69. Yet despite the hardships he experienced, May became known for his kindness. He became a popular guest at science fiction conventions and would remain at autograph tables until every fan had been helped. He once explained that he would continue signing until the final fan was finished or the cleaning crew forced him to leave. The industry may have overlooked the man inside the robot, but May made sure that the fans who loved the character never felt overlooked themselves. The robot became an enduring symbol of the series, but even the show's creation had a hidden history. Before Dr. Smith, before the robot, and before the colorful alien adventures, Irwin Allen had envisioned something much more serious. The original Lost in Space pilot was called No Place to Hide. It was a 60-minute production filmed in late 1964 with a budget of roughly $600,000, making it one of the most expensive television pilots ever produced at that time. The production involved highly respected talent. The cinematographer had won 3 Academy Awards, the special effects supervisor would later become an Oscar winner, and the writer would eventually contribute to Star Trek. Allen also received financial backing from CBS, 20th Century Fox, Red Skelton, and Groucho Marx. The original story was dramatically different from the series audiences eventually knew. The Robinson family was sent toward Alpha Centauri but was thrown off course by a meteor storm. They eventually landed on an alien world and were forced to survive. There was no Dr. Smith, no robot, no comic villain, and very little of the exaggerated humor that later defined the series. The Robinson family was portrayed as highly educated and intelligent, with both parents holding doctorates and the children portrayed as prodigies. Will Robinson even sat around a campfire and sang Greensleeves. Allen expected CBS executives to respond seriously to the pilot. Instead, they loved it and immediately approved the series. But they also wanted changes. CBS believed the series needed a recurring antagonist who could create conflict week after week. Allen suggested Ming the Merciless, while another story editor proposed a character inspired by Long John Silver. Eventually, they created Dr. Zachary Smith. CBS also demanded a robot. The ship was redesigned, and the original serious version of the pilot was put away. Large portions of that original footage were eventually reused in the first 5 episodes of the series. Dr. Smith and the robot were written as having remained behind on the ship, allowing the older footage to be incorporated even though those characters had not existed when the scenes were originally filmed. Lost in Space premiered on September 15, 1965. The Jupiter 2 interior set was enormously expensive for its time, reportedly costing $350,000. Even more fascinating, the show's famous theme was written by a young composer named Johnny Williams, who would later become the legendary John Williams. The original serious concept had been transformed into something much more commercial. And for a while, the decision worked extremely well. But another science fiction series was developing at the same time, creating one of television's most unusual rivalries. The competition between Lost in Space and Star Trek is often misunderstood. Today, Star Trek is generally remembered as the more serious and influential science fiction series, but during their original television runs, the ratings picture was very different. Lost in Space consistently ranked higher in the Nielsen ratings, while Star Trek struggled much more with its weekly numbers. The rivalry actually began before either series reached the screen. Gene Roddenberry initially pitched Star Trek to CBS, but the network was already developing Lost in Space and was not interested in purchasing another science fiction project. Roddenberry eventually took his idea to NBC. The 2 shows then spent 3 seasons competing for the attention of science fiction fans, even though they never aired in exactly the same timeslot. One of the funniest stories from the rivalry occurred during the 3rd season of Lost in Space. The makeup department needed to create an alien character with pointed ears but had limited time and resources. Their solution was to borrow the molds used to create Spock's ears for Star Trek. They changed the color and used them on their own alien character. Fans immediately recognized the resemblance and accused